Welcome to the Exploress, time traveling through women's history, one era at a time. I'm Kate Armstrong. Well, hey there, queens. We're taking a short break from our Viking series. Don't worry, it'll be in your ears before you know it. In the meantime, though, I'm bringing you the first installment in what I am now officially calling the Exploress Book Club. We've featured historical fiction authors on the show before, of course, but I want to bring you more of them. Historical fiction, at its best, is such a great time-traveling companion. This book club's going to be unique in that it's going to focus on the research that went into these novels. We're going to hone in on what a book has to tell us about life for the ladies in a certain time and place. Today, we're talking to the lovely Alison Goodman about her book, The Benevolent Society of Ill-Mannered Ladies. Alison's here to spill the very good tea on what being a woman in Regency England was really like. So, grab your police and get ready to try some Parmesan ice cream. Let's go traveling. But first, a shout out to some of my patrons. My warrior queens, MCF, Gail, Christina, Sarah, Amanda, Ika, June, Neve, and Sloan, Kate, Jessie, and Alexis. My imperial empresses, Sally, Letitia, Teresa, Samara, and Faye and Whimsy Soapworks. And my lady pharaohs, Lori, Kimberly, Cheryl, Kat, Laura, Bridget, Sophie, Kate, and the Fab Courtneys. If you love the show, you might consider becoming a patron. You'll get access to content you won't get on the main feed, including the video version of my chat with Alison, featuring some fun historical visual aids and a Pride and Prejudice joke or two. For the rest of May 2025, you can become a free patron and watch that video for $0. So what are you waiting for? Find out all about it on my website. Hi, Alison. Welcome to the Exploress. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be talking about the Regency.
Yes, I'm thrilled to have you because I know you have done so much research on this period, and also because I have already read twice The Benevolent Society of Ill-Mannered Ladies because I absolutely loved it, and I knew that I had to have you on the podcast to talk all about it.
Thank you very much. Yes, it's the adventures of Lady Gus and Lady Julia, and they continue in the new book, so I'm very excited.
Yes. Okay, well, we'll talk about that, but could we start with having you pitch the book for us?
Sure. I'll pitch the series. Let's see. It's about two 42-year-old spinster twin sisters, non-identical, and they are using their status as old maids and the invisibility that comes with that to help other women in peril. So they're using their privilege and that invisibility and their cleverness and life skills to kind of slide through society's expectations to be able to help these women and children out of very difficult and dangerous situations.
Yes, they're fantastic characters, and anyone who loves Jane Austen but also loves a lady sleuth, a lady adventuress in history, this is absolutely for you if you haven't read it yet. So let's talk a little bit about the Regency era. So I know this is a period that you've written about before. It's clearly one that you're drawn to and have spent a lot of time reading about. So what is it that drew you to this period and made you want to spend so much time writing about it?
Yeah, look, I suppose my love of the Regency came when I was about 12 and I read my first Georgette Heyer book. That was actually These Old Shades, which is set a little bit earlier, but then most of her books are set in the true Regency, which is 1811 to 1820. But there's also a longer Regency period that people acknowledge as well. And then, of course, there's the very long Georgian period, which the Regency is part of, in which all the Georges from 1 to 4 were in the monarchy and reigning. So I think that what drew me to it initially as a 12-year-old was the romance and the gorgeousness of the gowns and the balls and that kind of glamour of that period. And then as I read Jane Austen and discovered, how this period was when the advent of civility came into being. So before the Regency, there was the Georgian era, which was very rambunctious, lewd. There was a lot of kind of roughness and things like that. And then along came this idea of manners. And what we had basically was this veneer of civility stuffed on top of the Georgian rambunctiousness, which kind of really fascinated me because, underneath all that kind of civility was a lot of human emotion and a human kind of yearnings. And so that's what led me to write the first book that I had in the Regency, which is the Lady Helen books. And that's got a supernatural element. So that's, I call that Pride and Prejudice meets Buffy. And it was, I created this demonic kind of force that fed on all of that pressed emotion that was being squashed down by civility. And then when I decided to move just into straight historical fiction, which is the Benevolent Society of Ill-Mannered Ladies, I had the chance to do that under a PhD. I was studying my PhD, and I had that time and that sort of room to study the Regency and methods of researching it. So yeah, that's how I came to sort of be so immersed in the Regency era.
And this book absolutely does an amazing job of immersing us in the period. Historical fiction is such an interesting genre. Sometimes it can feel like set dressing the history, and sometimes it can feel the opposite of that. I can't think of a word for the opposite of that, but just really immersive and just so many incredible details that show that you really did your homework on this period and that you understand it really well. So I am hoping that you can give us a bit of a glimpse into what life was really like for women in this period. I know that it's going to depend, of course, as in all periods, very much on who you are, what your status is, how much money you have, where you live, all of that. So let's actually start with our heroines, Augusta and Julia. How typical would you say they are, their lives for women of the Regency, and how are they unique?
Well, I don't think they're particularly typical because when I was building the whole world of the Colebrook sisters, what I needed to do was be able to have them have the agency to be able to sleuth. And agency then, and of course now, has a great reliance upon financial stability and being able to, be comfortable in that sense. So I gave the sisters financial independence, which was not that typical. It wasn't unheard of, but they did have their own money, and they have their own household. Not only that, but they are unmarried, and that financial background has enabled them to stay unmarried. If Augusta's choice, and Julia through the fact that her betrothed had a tragic accident. So in that terms of their financial independence, probably not that typical. There were, of course, financially independent women at that time. And if you go down to what was called, and I use the vernacular of the day, the lower orders,
Mm-hmm.
there were women working. We had the domestic servants. We had women who were bakers and assisting their husbands in many kind of trades and things like that. So it wasn't unheard of for women to have agency. But the sisters have a special kind of agency, which is to some degree atypical.
Mm-hmm.
They're unique also in that I wanted to create a character, and of course the books are told from Lady Augusta's point of view. Slightly snarky, things to learn with she goes through her life, but she is an apostate in a society that is very religious, and that gives her and me as an author the chance to start looking at her society in a more critical manner. And so she's thinking, well, if there is no God, because she is lost her faith, apostasy, losing her faith, she's thinking, well, where does all these edicts come from? If they're not coming from God, who are they coming from? And so she's questioning the mandate that was very much the situation, was that where you are in your social world is where you stay. And she's questioning that. She's questioning how women are being treated and their place. So in that sense, while I try to make Gus all of her possibly modern outlooks, I always seed them in what was happening at that time. So her apostasy was not unheard of. Shelley, the poet, was sent down from university because he wrote a paper on atheism. So atheism was around at that time. It was beginning to be discussed. Her views on people of colour and society stem from the abolition movement at that time, the anti-slavery movement. So these are the things that, while they have a very modern kind of roots, I suppose, not roots, so kind of branches into our world, they were rooted in that period. So while her attitudes are not untypical, I mean, the abolition movement was very, very big in the Regency and resulted in slavery being abolished, although mainly on paper at that point. It took quite a while for it to actually be enacted, but legislation did go through during the Regency, just slightly before the true Regency. So they are women with great agency, but there were women with agency at that time. So it's I suppose the demands of a fictional series have created perhaps more agency than would have been, but still always rooted in the fact that there were people who were having these attitudes at the time and living lives that had more agency.
And I found it interesting, too, that these are probably two women with as much agency as you can have as women in the Regency, but they still run up against, restrictions and limitations all the time in trying to do what they want to do. They have a brother who, while he doesn't control them financially, he does have some sway as the patriarch of the family over, say, their family home, their ancestral home, and what happens to it. There's a storyline. We don't love the brother. Just in case you haven't read the book yet, you're not going to love the brother. I don't think it's a spoiler to say. But, he is thinking about getting married. And there's the whole question of, well, if he takes a wife, are the sisters kind of going to be demoted in the family circle? What is it? Are they going to be pushed out? He's always trying to control what they do. And he does have some control over their world. And he does make it harder for them to do what they want to do. So I liked that, because I do feel like you give us this window into even these women with money and agency and some freedom are frustrated in what they can do, and also in the expectations that their society has about who they should be and what they should do and not do. And
Yeah.
especially when it comes to Gus, who, calls it like she sees it and isn't afraid to make a, somewhat spicy remark at times.
Yeah. Well, the writing, the brother's called Duffy, and writing Duffy is just a hoot. He's appalling man, but very much a symbol of what the attitudes were at that time, especially about older women, that when we think about women who are ending up in terrible situations, is because, women's, I suppose, mental health was always, something that was suspicious. There was something being suspicious of, and older women, experiencing women's, just natural evolution were, considered to be suspicious all the time. And Gus, with her views and her cleverness, and her desire to be of use, beyond what society wanted her to be, because as we probably know, is that women's duty was to have children. In fact, women's lives could be seen as transactions around their body. So that when you were a young woman, it was about marriage, and those marriage prospects were about a transaction, about being buying, if we would look at it in terms of like buying safety and comfort with your ability to be fertile and produce children. And then your position as a married woman was transactional according to if you had children or not. Could you have children? Did you provide heirs? And then after that had happened or not happened, your use after that, what was it? And so that was older women were not seen as particularly useful in that society unless they had produced those children, those heirs. And so it's pretty much transactional. And Gus is not having a bar of that. She wants to be of use the whole way through her life.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So yes, and Duffy's attitudes are pretty much probably, I think, fairly conventional for that time. Women's intelligence was not considered to be particularly high. Education was wasted on them. As I said, their emotions were things to be, managed. There was sense and sensibility. If you want to talk about that, there's that sensibilities. Yeah, it was. Women were thought not to be able to think critically. So it was very much that. It was very derisive of women's autonomy in any sense. I mean, I think maybe the listeners will have heard of this before, but there was a law that subsumed a woman into her husband's legal status called coverture. And so she did not legally have an identity at that time. There was, once you were married, you had no legal identity, which is just appalling and which has echoes right through to today's laws.
It does. The ramifications of that law are something that we see again and again in the book as Gus and Julia try to help several women who have ended up in really difficult situations because they don't have legal rights and their husbands can decide what to do with them, which we'll talk about a little bit more later.
Yep.
But to your point about these beliefs in the Regency era about women being the weaker sex in several ways, I want to talk about how Lady Gus uses that to her advantage. At one point, she tells us that to be constantly underestimated sometimes worked in one's favor. So we've talked a little bit about some of the common beliefs and expectations around women of the time, but what are some of the ways the heroines of your story use these attitudes to their advantage?
Well, Lady Gus both of them are very clever and in very different ways too. Although they are twins, they complement each other in terms of what they bring to the sleuthing partnership. It's I suppose it's what the expectations of women would be doing at that time, and Gus saying, well, absolutely not. I'm going to dress up as a man and walk through a male dominated area, and see what that is like, because the idea of a woman dressing up as a man was so beyond what would be expected that it would not have been picked up. So women dressing as men was occasionally occurring on the theatre stage. I think they were called trouser rolls or pants rolls for women. And that was seen as very titillating because, of course, if a woman was wearing breeches, you would be able to see her cuff and her ankle. And so they were usually a titillating kind of.
And the curves of her derriere, I would imagine.
That's right. And so those expectations of not being particularly clever. At one point, Julia has a vaporish fit as cover for other stuff being done because the male in question was backing away from such displays of womanly hysteria, and so in the background while that was happening, things where the real kind of business of saving people was being done. So there was lots of being able to play up to those conventional ideas of women fainting or women of not being able to do things so that they can get on with the real business of adventure.
And I have to say that scene where Gus dresses up as a man and she goes into a public house and she's doing something extremely bold and you just think, how is she ever going to pull this off? But like you say, she does, partially because no one in that room would ever expect a woman to do what she's doing. And I thought your descriptions of what it felt like to try to exude manliness and shove her, all the training of her feminine life aside were really interesting because they gave us glimpses into the kinds of things you would need to think about, like, what it felt like to wear pants and fabric rubbing in strange places and learning how to take up space, thinking about taking up space instead of trying to make yourself smaller. And regular listeners of the Exploress know I'm obsessed with historical fashion. I think it's fascinating, and I think it tells us so much about life for women and how they move through the world in different periods. So I'm hoping we can talk a little bit about fashion, and you can tell us about kind of what are the staple pieces that a woman in the Regency is wearing. And I also want to talk about underwear. I actually had a question from a patron. They wanted to ask you about underwear and whether women in the Regency were actually wearing them. And if so, what were they like?
That's right. Well, the fashions were really interesting, and when I was dressing Gus in the male fashion, she did have things between her legs because the men would push they didn't wear drawers generally, but they would push the shirt front between their legs as sort of like when they put the breeches on, and so she had something there because women did not wear gusseted underwear. So they were wearing sort of like a kind of a leg and a leg that would be tied up around the waist so that you'd have an open gusset area. That's possibly what some people might have worn, but generally not. It was that you wore a petticoat. And atop the petticoat, you would put your corset. The corsets in the Regency had become a lot shorter, so they came under the bust because, of course, the gowns themselves had become Empire line, just under the bust. So that's where the seam was. And so the corsets ended just under. They were just like a bra, really. And I've got one. I have, obviously, I've got actually quite a few specifically made historical Regency clothes. The corset itself is quite comfortable. Yeah, it feels like a bra. The arms are slightly off the shoulder to accommodate the wide necklines at the time because the empire gown would show off the curve of the bust, but it also showed a lot of the décolletage, which was the real estate of the time. That's where all the eyes would go. So being able to show that area and to decorate it with jewels, to if you weren't particularly well endowed that area, you could buy fake breasts that were made out of wax. So don't stand too close to the fireplace. There were some examples of melting breasts in those times. So there were enhancers in that sense. And then you would never wear your corset against skin. It was always with the chemise underneath it. Then you'd have a petticoat, and depending on what season it was, that might be a fine lawn petticoat, or it might be something that was much thicker for winter. And on top of that would be the gown. The gowns were, of course, we didn't have zippers, we had buttons, but we also had fashions where the front of the gown would be pinned up on the side of the shoulders. So you'd be wearing pins all the time to pin up the gown. And then for outerwear, there would be the Spencer, which is the short jacket. So a crop jacket and absolutely gorgeous. I've got a couple myself. They're fabulous. And they would be intricately created. They would have a diamond shape on the back, which where the shoulders met the armhole. So there'd be like a diamond shape. And it didn't leave a lot of movement. There was not, it wasn't too bad, but it did hold you in. The longer version of that was the police, which was a full length or 3/4 length, or a redincoat, which again were built for warmth. And you would have boots for day wear, for being able to walk around outside. And in the evenings, it'd be slippers. And if you were going to a ball, you would probably wear because transport to a ball was not always assured. You might have to walk. You would wear your boots to the ball, especially if you were rural, and then you would have your slippers in a bag, and you'll change into your slippers in the ladies' retiring room and dance in those slippers. And sometimes the slippers didn't last a night because they were made of silk and things like that. So if you were dancing hard, like Lydia did and Lydia Bennett, she danced every dance, you might rip your slippers to shreds, but they'd be carried. If you were riding and you were of the class that had a riding outfit, that would be more manly. So you'd have a riding jacket with possibly a shirt and cravat, a riding skirt, and sometimes, and this came in probably around 1816, people might question this, but I think it was 1816, knitted pantaloons for women who were riding. So they did have a gusset because if you went off your horse with legs akimbo, they were riding side saddle. So sometimes there was knitted pantaloons. And the Princess Caroline, the Prince Regent's daughter, I think brought those into respectability. Pantaloons themselves were seen to be associated with prostitutes generally. So there was a big social getting used to the whole idea of the gusseted pantaloon because often prostitutes would just be in those most of the day.
Interesting.
So that's sort of how that. But when women had their period, it was either a free flow where they would not go out in public and just in the gown, or they would have pads that they'd made themselves. So that was kind of like, there's not a lot of research around what was happening when women were menstruating, but that's considered what was going on. And you literally retire for a few days during the heavy days and that kind of stuff.
An excuse to stay at home and relax in the sitz
Yeah,
bath, probably.
yeah, go upstairs. And so that's sort of what a upper class, aspirational class would be wearing. Women who were in the lower orders would have less clothing. Of course, they would not have a wider wardrobe. Those in the upper class would be buying a lot of clothes for the season, and those who were in the genteel class who couldn't afford those kind of changes of clothes, 3 to 4 changes of clothes a day, would always try to change what they were wearing a little bit for evening. So you would always change and dress for dinner. And that might be a fabulous little invention that people had, which they would put on a false bodice and button it up over the gown so that it changed the look of the gown. They would do, they'd have a fichu during the day, which was a covering of the chest area. Take that off, put jewelry on, just a change to make sure that they had dressed for dinner.
Yeah, so of course it's going to depend so much on how much money you have and what your social class is, what you're going to be wearing and when. I do find it very interesting that for upper class women in the evening that they're showing so much arm and shoulder and décolletage, and yet if you flash an ankle, girl, you're getting sent to jail for that. It's so
Yeah.
interesting to me.
Yeah, and that came. There was a lot more flashing of body parts in the Regency, interestingly, than the later period, which is the Victorian period, which was kind of like a backlash almost towards the form showing styles of the Regency period. Because in the upper classes there was a lot more. To some degree, at some point, the gown was so low that you could get a hint of nipple. And so there was that low and that sheer. There's also the story of that people were wetting themselves down so that their form could show more in their muslins, because the muslins were very sheer. And whether or not that is true, I'm not sure. It seems very, dangerous in an English climate. Freeze to death. In the outerwear was also that there were the beautiful shawls that were coming from India, and things like. So these were the luxury goods that people would buy to wrap themselves up during dinner and things like that. Always the gloves. You would always have gloves. I did quite a lot of research about what women would do with their gloves when they came to a ball and they had to have supper. Would they take their gloves off? What was happening there? Yeah, where would they put their gloves? What was that?
Yeah.
Because you never touched. When you're dancing, you did not touch hands to hands. It was always glove to glove. And hats and bonnets, always to protect the skin from any sun that happened to be around. And also style as well. There was many styles, from little caps. It was influenced by the wars that were going on. That a lot of the styles during the 1810 to 1815 period were military, because that was when the Napoleonic Wars were still raging. You had a lot of what was called frogging. And when I first came across that as a 12-year-old, I had no idea what frogging would be. I'm thinking, frogging, how exotic. Which is called as like a braiding with buttons that did up there and that kind of stuff. So the frogging and epaulets and things like that, which echoed the military. There was a hat called the shako, which was a very tall hat with a small brim, often worn for riding. Absolutely no safety possibilities at all.
Yeah. Yeah, I do think it's interesting how, I never thought about this, reading and watching things like Pride and Prejudice growing up, but you do see these things echoed in a lot of in the period, this military style that really makes its way into women's fashion, as you say, the epaulettes, which are beautiful. You watch almost any period film that's trying to be historically accurate, and you will see epaulettes and frogging on their spencers and details on their dresses. Just I think as far as women's fashion goes, as you say, the Victorian era becomes very structured and I think for women particularly uncomfortable. But the Regency, if you're going to travel back in time, I think that would be a nice one to go back to. You'd be fairly comfortable, I think.
Yeah. It was much more comfortable fashion. I've just read a fascinating paper about the genesis of that style, which came from France, and it was there was four women, I believe, three or four women, who were the beauties of after the revolution, and they set about creating a comfortable way of wearing clothes. And this paper posited that it was a very deliberate development of that style to be different from the elaborate court styles of the pre-revolution, where there was the great big sort of panniers on either side and the busks in the middle and that kind of stuff, and where everything was kind of quite heavy and structured, to these free flowing, free. I mean, the freedom was the whole thing of that post revolution style. And they that just travelled across. Even though the two countries were at war, there was always English were always keeping an eye on the fashions in Paris, and they did come across with emigres and people fleeing Paris and that kind of stuff, and people passing through. So the styles did come through.
Mm.
Having said that, the men's style of the country English gentleman made its way across to Paris. So it was like that two thing there. So there was those kind of two back and forth of how men and women dressed.
Interesting. And speaking of things that started in France and came over to England, let's talk about Augusta's hairstyle. She has a pretty drastic haircut
Mm-hmm.
to aid in her dressing and trying to pass as a man on one of her adventures. And I was interested in this because I hadn't, to memory, I don't think I've ever read about what is essentially like a pixie cut situation for a woman in the Regency era. But you do talk about, I think it was Caroline Lamb, maybe, who made this style popular. Can you just tell us a little bit about this? Because this was a real thing.
Yeah, it was a real thing. It actually happened a couple of times, really. So the first time, it was a very grim nod towards the guillotine. So women, before they were beheaded, would have their heads shorn. And after the revolution, there was a fashion, I don't know how long lived, to be wearing a red ribbon around your throat to indicate the cut and to have your hair short. So it was like a nod, if you like, towards that kind of grim part of their history. And that was in Paris. And then during sort of the period that I'm writing about, because I kind of specialise around the 1812, 1813 area, Lady Caroline Lamb, who came into prominence for her affair with Lord Byron.
Very, very, very public affair with Lord Byron.
Very public affair, very public affair. And she wore her hair in a very short style. She would often, for just a fun jape, and I use the vernacular, the jape, to dress as a page boy and go where Lord Byron was, and to play around with that whole gender identity and things like that. And so the crop became quite fashionable for a while. And it was, if you think about it, it was also quite practical because you didn't have the problems with the lice and the nits and having to keep your very long hair clean, which was a major duty if they did keep it clean. We have a very clean idea of the Regency from fiction and adaptations, when actually, in fact, it was a lot grottier than we can even imagine. Especially just think about the fact that all transport was by horse.
Mm-hmm.
So the amount of dung everywhere was mountainous.
It would have been everywhere. It would have been everywhere.
It
Yep.
had been everywhere. And there were people who made livings from putting planks across, dung, so that people could walk across the street without dragging all of their clothes through the dung. People wore pattens which were basically huge platform clogs with their boots inside, so they could clump across and not be sort of swishing through excrement
No one
and
wants to
mud.
swim through the night soil. No one.
That's right. So so Caroline's shortcut was emulated, but with the hair that was cut off, it was often made into ringlets and buns, so false hair, so that you could change up your pixie cut into other styles and pin them in. You could pin ring. You could buy fake ringlets.
Huh.
So nothing new. Nothing
Yeah.
new in this
Hair
world.
extensions, not a new invention.
Yeah, no, not at all. And you could have a bun that was made. So the wig makers would be making those extra parts for your.
Interesting. Yeah, and that makes sense because a pixie cut is a distinct style. I the scene where Gus gets her haircut is great because Julia's quite scandalized by the change, and she makes sure that Gus, promises to have a bun and some ringlets and hair pieces made, so she has options.
Options, yes. But of course, Gus finds that she quite likes the pixie cut.
It suits her to a T, I'd say. Okay, so let's talk about within the book we see another thing that I haven't read a lot about in the Regency period, which is a lesbian relationship. So could you tell
Mm.
us a little bit about same-sex partnerships in the Regency? Because in the book, Gus does reference a few real life women who were living that life.
Yeah, yeah. Well, it's an interesting kind of history, really, because there was also a very strong tradition of the romantic female friendship. So that was probably a very different thing from a lesbian relationship. Intense friendships often developed at schools or seminaries, and they were, as far as we can tell, generally platonic. And then, of course, there were lesbian relationships that were being lived fairly openly because the idea of women choosing women over men was so out of the what? Why would a woman choose another woman over having a male
I
partner?
mean, they can't have children together, which is a woman's primary function, and
That's
women
right.
don't have sexual urges, Allison.
That's right. They just don't. So the idea of that was hard for the Regency mind to get around, but not impossible. So some of the real life lesbian relationships, and this one is in question because I think they really did put forward that it was a romantic platonic relationship was the ladies of Llangollen. Now that's my English way of pronouncing it. There is a very particular Welsh saying way of pronouncing it, which I cannot manage. I've had my Welsh friends go over and over it with me, and my mouth just does not make that shape. So there's a lot of guttural, like, no, I can't even try it. It would just be the Welsh people listening would just laugh me off the screen. So I'm giving a very, very English version of that place of Llangollen, and that was two women who, fascinatingly, Eleanor and Sarah Ponsonby and Eleanor Butler, nobles, who initially ran off together with, and I think this is gorgeous, a gun and a dog.
It's all you really need.
You need in life. They ran off together and were brought back by their families, who entreated them to not do this. And eventually, because of their bond was so strong, their families eventually gave in and they moved to Wales. They were Irish nobles. They moved to Wales and set up a household in Llangollen. And they lived a very long life. They lived a very long life together. And they also had their very, very loyal domestic servant, Anne, who actually left her own savings to them when she passed away because they lived such a long life. They, although were on reasonably good terms with their family, they were not given money. So they had to, they lived a lot on what was called the tick, which was, borrowing or just ordering stuff and not paying for it, which a lot of the nobles did.
It does seem that way, yes.
Yeah, yeah. But they were also on the way to Holyhead. So they were on one of the major roads to the crossover to Ireland. So they became a stopover for a lot of society. And they were great hostesses and they lived a very social life, even though they were in a small town in Wales. And they were horrified by a newspaper article about them because they were quite the scandal initially. And then people just kind of got used to this relationship and that. But then a newspaper article came out that kind of hinted that something, and I put this in inverted commas, untoward was about the relationship. And they sued the newspaper and said, no, absolutely not.
Interesting.
So they were very adamant about this. So although they are seen as the forerunners of queer relationships, it is up for debate whether or not that was a lesbian relationship or an intense romantic platonic relationship. But whatever the case, they do provide a template for a happy partnership for a very long time for a same-sex couple. Now, in a more overt way was Anne Lister. Her diaries have come to light relatively recently, and she wrote about her life as a lesbian, and the sex parts, when she wrote very, very frankly about lesbian sex, were in code and have only just been deciphered because there's a lot of let's not decipher this for the family's sake kind of thing, and let's put those diaries aside kind of thing. But now they have been deciphered. And she lived a very androgynous life in Regency England and into Victorian England. And she married a woman, a notional marriage, because, of course, same-sex marriage was not even considered at that point. Keeping in mind that male queer couples were, going to jail, getting executed, things like that. Terrible things were happening to them. Whereas the female couples, while they were possibly suffering at the level of their immediate surrounds, were not legally hounded. And Anne and her wife lived together, and were another couple that were living. They were living openly as well. It was never. I think it was probably never overtly discussed, but they were seen as a couple. And she was a very successful coal miner. Her family had coal holdings and things like that. So money does actually protect to some degree as well.
And patrons will actually have a bonus episode on Anne Lister in July, I believe. June or July, I can't remember. I don't have my schedule, but it's coming. And she is
Fantastic.
a fascinating figure. I do think it's interesting how these women living together, because of as you say, the beliefs about women at the time, it shielded them in a way. They were less likely, far, far less likely to be prosecuted. It's for a depressing reason of, women could never have these urges, and how could women ever have romance or anything without a man? But it did protect them in a way, whereas men who were, pursuing same-sex relationships were in a much more dangerous place in the public sphere and legally.
Very much so, yeah. I mean, there were many. I've read many terrible kind of stories of what happened to gay men and queer men, and so it was very dangerous to be queer at that time.
Mm-hmm.
So it is fascinating. I think that the lesbian relationships in the Benevolent Society of Ill-Mannered Ladies, and then into the second book, there's a lot of the ladies of Llangollen were entreated, and that they were, there was a lot of guilt placed on them for not marrying men, and not doing their duty. And so when they were sort of talking about these things, it was about having to stay stalwart against these kind of family obligations. So there's a lot of pressure from family to not create scandal, to not sully the name, and to do what was conventional. So and that kind of pressure can be extreme, for people, because they would be threatened with being excommunicated from the family and not having any financial support. Now this is very important because women did not have a way of supporting themselves, especially nobles. Like they didn't have any skills that would be able to be sold, if you like, in terms of being able to upkeep themselves. And then eventually, and I have to check this, but I believe I read that Lady Butler, Lady Eleanor Butler, and Sarah Ponsonby were given a pension by Queen Charlotte. Yes, so there was ways of women helping women. That I thought that was interesting. Yeah.
But yes, I mean, women were very dependent on their families, and specifically the men in their families. And that was true, from the top of the social ladder all the way to the bottom.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the things I love about this book is that you give us the glittering balls, you give us all the things we want certainly that I want in a Regency story, but you also take us to some of the grittier, darker corners, and especially into spheres where women come into real danger, the gritty shadows of this period in history. You take us to a brothel, which is dealing in child trafficking. Young girls are being kidnapped off the streets and taken to this brothel, and our heroines get involved in trying to save them. It's I mean, I could not put the book down. I stayed up way too late reading that scene because I needed to know what happened, but it's bleak. And then you also take us to a private madhouse, as they called them, a mental institution where women's families had committed them, most if not all of them, completely against their will. And that is also very bleak. So I was hoping we could talk a little bit about what can you tell us about those two spaces and how women ended up in these situations.
Yeah, look, the brothel and child trafficking was all of this is stemming from my research and what I've read about the so-called bawdy house of the Georgian era. Um, the the child trafficking, as we know, which is still with us today, um, was was in my book based on the heinous belief that a virgin child could cure venereal disease, syphilis mainly, by having sex with that child. And so there was a high price to be had with a child, for someone who would pay a high price for that. So, and that actually stems from, well, the earliest I could find reference to it was 1600, or even earlier, probably during the Renaissance. So it was,
It sounds like something the Renaissance would come up with.
yeah, yeah. I think it was even earlier, really, but that was kind of when I found kind of like a reference to it, and yeah, it was, I mean, there was a lot of underage prostitution in the Regency. There's a lot of prostitution in the Regency. There was, like, in London, there was, thousands and thousands of women eking out a living, sometimes, working, but also working as a prostitute as well. So there was a lot of sex workers at that time. And of course, we know that there's the Harris's Ladies of Covent Garden, which was a field guide to where you could find these women and what they offered. And so that space, that brothel space, was very much around in the Georgian time. And there was a lot of different types of brothels. There was these temples, well, they're called temples, the upper class temples, which were beautifully appointed with beautiful furniture and artwork. And there'd be courtesans if you wanted to do a kind of sort of where sex workers were sitting, sort of like they would be able, they were the demi-monde, they were called. So there was, the fringe of society women, and they would be kept by nobles. They would sometimes even marry them. There was a number of women who kind of moved through into that situation, but mostly there were women who were either in bawdy houses where they had been picked up from coming in from rural England, and they would be picked up pretty much, if we look at it from the bus stop, that would be like the carriage stop, the postilion place, and plied with booze, offered a place to stay, and then get trapped into these situations where they would have to work off the food and the drink and the clothes that they were given as sex workers, and then they were just completely trapped into that world. And even actually Jane Austen makes a joke about it, a grim joke, to her sister Cassandra in one of the letters, saying that when she's going to London, she might get pulled over by a fat abbess, whatever, and plied with small beer. So there was very much a known thing to happen, and we had Hogarth did a series of that where a woman is seen, in a series of prints of going through the whole process and dying early as a sex worker. So those places Covent Garden was just built around that. It was the sex industry area. Those spaces which were not inhabited by upper class women, of course, so Gus and Julia going into those spaces would have been very confronting for them. But having said that, there were some brothels that were set up for women, upper class women, to have sex. But of course, that was hugely expensive, and for only kind of very, very few of those. But they were there as well. We can't ignore the fact that they were there as well. But mostly, it was the they were just there. Basically, they were rife everywhere, as was women They were called hedge whores.
Yeah.
Yeah. That was the vernacular of the time, where they would be basically into the hedge with the person for a penny, a shilling, or whatever it was. So there was a whole range of sex workers who were trying to eke out a living.
And certainly there would have been women who perhaps would have chosen that life, but a lot of women, I would say the majority of women who didn't, and who ended up there um, because they were forced into that life, or because they didn't really have any other choice. So it is, I mean, if you haven't read the book yet, I mean, I don't want to spoil it for people who haven't read it yet, but I will say it is harrowing, but it's also very exciting. And that is when Gus dresses up as a man. It's to get into this bawdy house to try to rescue these girls who are being held there. So um, it was, I think it's interesting. We do have this picture of the Regency as this, it's about being about refinement and manners. But of course, as you say, London was full of bawdy houses. They were everywhere. They weren't a secret. And in so many of them, you're going to find women in these difficult situations. So I thought that was fascinating. And then we get to the private madhouse, which just kicks everything up to a whole new level when it comes to women and their rights under the law in Regency England.
Yeah, yeah. When I did the research for the private madhouses, so in England, there were government-run madhouses, or insane asylums in the language of the time, and then there were the private madhouses, which were run by what were called mad doctors, and the doctors themselves weren't mad, but they were, but they were well, one could argue, but they were pretty much just making money out of mental illness or perceived mental illness. There was a lot of people in there who probably shouldn't have been in there. They were sometimes just catering to a particular class of women. And the one that I chose to depict was one that was for upper middling to upper class women. And they were terrible, terrible places. The research that I did was so harrowing that I had to say to myself, you're writing a romp. Let's just pull it back. So although it's quite what I think I wrote was harrowing enough, there was a lot of stuff that I didn't put in there because it was kind of like, no, yeah, I just can't go there.
Yeah, we don't see a lot of treatments. I mean, it is quite harrowing. It's not easy to read in moments, but we don't see a lot of treatments. I'm sure there's so much that you spared us from that you discovered in your research.
Yeah, I mean, the treatments were barbaric, straight barbaric. There was, just reading about it, and I just think, my skin crawls even now just thinking about it. And it's like, 2 years ago that I read about it. So the way that they were run was that there were very few laws around them. There was a kind of reform happening at the time that I was writing, that people were beginning to start saying, hey, wait a minute, you can't just plonk someone in one of these places and forget about them. Let's have some regulations around it. Not often, kept up because there was not a lot of regulatory bodies, shall we say. But there was a sense that you could that were fragile mentally. That was a kind of conventional thought, and so that any of these kind of, I mean, when you probably have seen these things on the memes and that about the lists of what women could be sent into an asylum for reading novels, drinking tea, and there were some very strange beliefs about drinking tea at the beginning, and drinking hot chocolate and that kind of stuff that would overstimulate and create madness and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
So, but there were a number of documented cases where women were put into these asylums to just get rid of them and to get them out of the picture, if you like. And some of the friends of these women would fight for them to get out, and they won. And so there was more of a kind of fail-safe system put in place so that didn't happen as often, but it did happen. And of course, there were those people who were mentally ill who ended up in these places, which of course were the worst places for them to end up.
Yes.
They were just horrific.
And under the law, because women didn't really have legal personhood, a husband who was sick of his wife, who was troublesome, who just wanted, as you say, to get her out of the way, could commit her to one of these places. That was his legal right. And there wasn't really anything she could do about it.
No. And I read about sort of cases where women would be committed and then would have to try and get letters out to other family members to try and get them to intercede on their behalf. Meanwhile, they were being brutalized. So many, I mean, there were a number of women who came out of those places pregnant because they were called basket men, and they were the thugs, basically, who kept the women into submission, and they were raped, and they were chained up, and they were kept in kind of like straw beds where they would just be sleeping and living in their own excrement. And there would be treatments that were just, you just look at them and say, well, that's just torture. So those were the pre-reform mental asylums. And then in the Benevolent Society of Ill-Mannered Ladies, I reference the Quakers, and they were beginning to bring in more enlightened views. Initially only for those who were Quakers, but gradually those views took hold, not to extraordinary degrees, but because we know that through the Victorian era as well, there was some atrocities as well. But at the very beginning, the Quakers were thinking about the fact that good nutrition, walking in the air, giving small responsibilities that were in the capabilities of those who were suffering was a better way to go, rather than shutting them up in a bath and dripping water on their head for hours on end.
Yeah, whoever thought that was actually a good idea clearly didn't like women very much.
No.
Well, I think we should move on to a lighter note, shall we?
Yes.
It is a romp, I promise. I've read it twice, and I can say that with authority. So I want to play a little game of true or false. So this is based on some historical details that you put in the book that I picked up and thought were really interesting. And I found myself going, really? Is that true? And I'm sure the answer probably is yes, it is true, but I still have to ask. So, true or false of the Regency era, Parmesan ice cream?
True.
I can't even imagine what this really tastes like. But so there was a fad for Parmesan ice cream.
There was a cheese ice cream. I mean, I think that, when you think about it, there's a nice kind of saltiness and a kind of pungency to Parmesan. Ice cream was very much the rage, and brought in by, the top chefs of the time, because there's a lot of French chefs who came from Paris when they were fleeing Napoleon's world and the revolution. So there was. I think I love the idea that when you're making ice cream in England, you would go to the ice house, which was huge blocks of ice kept in this cave at the bottom of your estate into the summer from the winter, and you could carve that, and so the chef could come and get a block of ice and shave it and make ice cream with it. So Parmesan ice cream was a real thing.
Okay, well, to see if I can find some. What about pineapples as a centerpiece? So not to be eaten, but just to be aesthetically enjoyed.
Yes, true. They were generally not eaten. They were left there to rot. As far as you would keep them as much as possible and pass them around to friends to use as centerpieces. They were very much a signifier of wealth and status. So don't eat that pineapple. Just look at it.
Just look at it. Just look at it. Interesting. Okay, so true or false, were women wearing purples, violets when they were in mourning?
Interesting. They would initially have worn black, but as the mourning period progressed, and it would generally be a year, you would be able to move into the darker purples after the year of black. Could have been shorter. It depends on your relationship with the person who passed. So how, you might have gone immediately into the mauves, and that is about relationship, but you would be going through the levels of the purples and black, purples, mauves, and then basically you would be back into normal clothing. But it was a mark of respect. Men would be wearing armbands. Servants would be wearing armbands as well. So it was the master and mistress's duty to provide all their servants with armbands when someone passed close to the family.
And so interesting for a woman. I could see it having pros and cons. Pro, someone can just look at you and know you're in mourning, and perhaps that's helpful. So you don't have to talk about it if you don't want to. They can respect the fact that you're in mourning, but also a year plus is a long time to wear black and to wear veils and to kind of retire from society to an extent, which I know they had to do. And women were the ones who bore the brunt of that with mourning, it seems.
Yeah. Yeah, and you couldn't dance for a certain amount of time, not show enjoyment, basically. You were in mourning, and that was that. That was the requirement.
Okay. Did they really call the lady who runs a bawdy house an abbess?
Yes, there were many names for the owner of a bawdy house, but the abbess was one of them. And in fact, one bawdy house owner played on the abbess idea by having a Bible at the front of in the foyer of the bawdy house, so that she was the abbess with the open Bible.
I'm sure real life abbesses loved that. Okay, well, I have one more question for you, and I know it's a big one, but in the course of your research into women's lives in this period, what did you find that particularly surprised or delighted you?
Hmm. Hmm. Well, I think that what I did find and what I did use in the Benevolent Society of Ill-Mannered Ladies was a letter from Frances Burney to her sister-in-law that details her mastectomy
Hmm.
without anesthetic. I was quite fascinated because I thought, well, what did they call it in the Regency? What they called it was cancer, and it has been called cancer since the ancient Greek times. Um, I was fascinated by this letter, and when I first read it and found out about it, and what it does, Frances Burney was a diarist, a novelist, a woman of letters. She also was the keeper of the Queen's robes for Queen Charlotte, so she had a lot of connections. She wrote a very famous novel called Evelina,
I read it in
quite early.
college and I loved it.
Yeah, yeah, quite early in her career. And she established herself as a woman of letters very quickly. And so her ability to describe this medical procedure is superb. She married a Frenchman and went to live in France during the truce, I think, which is 1802, but then got caught because the truce was very short lived. And so she got caught in France for 10 years without being able to come back to England. She did come back in 1812, which occurs in the Benevolent Society of Ill-Mannered Ladies. So I had to marry up those kind of that time with what was really happening, because in the books I try to keep to true historical timelines. And this letter was written in 1811. Frances Burney found a lump in her breast. She tried many treatments, and then her surgeon decided that it had to be removed because she was beginning to get more ill. And so, at the detailing of how that occurred, there was about, I think there was 7 or 9 medical men at that thing. They actually just arrived. She said to them, just arrive and do it. Don't tell me when you're doing it. So it was done at her home. She was held down on a bed. There was no anesthetic. She described every feeling when she was conscious, and then the after effects as well. She survived. Astonishingly, she survived and lived very, very happily for another, 30 years or so. So it is. I think it is one of the most important medical documents for women that is out there. You can read it, you can see it, you can see the letter in the British Library website, and you can read the transcript of it. When I was using that transcript to put the words into Fanny Burney's mouth because she tells someone about this experience, and I use that letter as the resource, I felt a great feeling of responsibility to keep to the essence of that, to those words, but of course I had to put them into a dialogue version and I had to go and meld it into my own style. So it was very much a delicate process of rewriting and rewriting so that the importance of her experience was in no way diminished. And so that was a very much, not so much a delight, but a wonder that this exists, that experience exists in such a brilliantly described letter.
Yeah, that we have that and the courage she showed, and that, as you say, she survived that procedure, that procedure existed and was tried in the Regency. These were all things I didn't know.
Yeah, yeah, and I didn't know until I kind of discovered it myself, and I knew that one of the main characters would be dealing with health issues, and when I found that letter, I thought, yeah, this is the way that it needs to be discussed, about not a male doctor talking to a female. This is a woman to woman thing, about this is the experience, that because the books are about women's experience, and about sisterhood in both, the actual sisterly bond between Gus and Julia, but also the sisterhood of women, in the world, and how women help each other, and also don't help each other. We have to say that there's some kind of people who work against that sisterhood. So I think that was one of the wonders. One of the delights that I found was that it was possible to work out how long a ball was intended to last by the size of the candles in the chandelier as you walked into the ball. So candles were sold in hourly increments, if you like. So there was a 4-hour candle, there was a 6-hour candle, and there was an 8-hour candle. And if you walked in and there was a 4-hour candle, you think, oh, okay, it's not going to be that long.
Basically, the light, instead of the lights being turned on in our era, it's the lights being turned off. Everyone out, goodbye.
Everyone out, yeah. It's all guttering. All the candles are guttering. It's not going to be a long one, because a lot of the balls would start, just after, like probably about 8 o'clock or that, and then go on to about 3 or 4 or 5 in the morning, and you'd be driving home in the dawn or walking home in the dawn because a lot of people didn't have the expensive way of traveling, which was by horse. If you have a look at a lot of the letters of the time, and if you look at the kind of behind the scenes, there's a lot of, I'm waiting for someone to come along that can give me a ride to this place with their thing. Then I've got to wait to then I can got to go wait 3 weeks to stay at these people's places so I get a ride here. So when people stayed at other people's houses, they stayed for a long time. The visits were quite a long time. And I think what's often not shown in historical fiction is that there was always extraneous people living in your house. And there'd always be a guest, someone on their way to somewhere else, somewhere who was helping you with your kids while you, whatever. Yeah, there's always like a guest going on, especially in the bigger houses.
And get ready for them to stay for a very long time, whether you like it or not.
Yeah, that's right. And you would be putting them up and keeping them for that time. And that's why when women were not married, they would be bouncing around households because the expense. That's why we see that Charlotte in Pride and Prejudice, she's scared of being a burden because she would not be having a household of her own, and she would have to be a burden to her parents or a burden to all being passed around family members to do the drudgery of a spinster life, being of service because she hadn't fulfilled that so-called womanly role of having her own household and bearing children.
Yeah, and that was a pressure that Jane Austen, to an extent, felt too. I mean, it was a specter for every woman, not just being a burden to your parent, but also not having the agency that becoming a wife does give you in terms of, at least financially, you're secure, we hope, mostly.
Yeah, and having a household to run, to be able to have that luxury of being able to, and this, of course, is women of a certain class, but even the lower orders would have their households.
Mm-hmm.
That you'd be able to manage a household as you wished to a certain degree, because always one had to say that, well, the patriarch of that household would have the final say in everything. But having said that, when you look at some of the letters between husbands and wives, there is quite a lot of deference to the domestic for women, so that was their domain, and it was considered to be their domain. So decoration and managing that domain, there was quite some deference to that, and that became even more so in the Victorian era, as those two spheres of the public life and the domestic life were separated out, and women were definitely in that domestic life and not within the public sphere.
Well, this has been fascinating. We've talked about a lot. There's so much about the Benevolent Society that we have not discussed, and we will leave it for you to discover, listeners, if you haven't read it yet. So the second book in the series, The Lady's Road Guide to Utter Ruin, by the time this episode comes out, it will also be out wherever you get your books. I, for one, cannot wait to read it. Where can listeners find you and find out more about your books?
Yeah, I'm on Instagram at Alison Goodman Author. My website is www.alisongoodman.com.au. I do have a lot of events coming up in Melbourne soon because of the launch of the Ladies' Road Guide to Utter Ruin. And as Kate reminded me, I should put those events on my website. So that'll be up, put those up today so that when you do hear this, that they will be available for you to look at. But I also post them on my socials as well. So yeah, lots of lovely activity and events to talk about Lady Gus and Lady Jewel and their adventures as they save women.
Yes, it's really a book for anyone who likes a story about an adventurous woman in history, women helping women. I mean, it certainly ticks all of my boxes. I am loving the series so far. I'm hoping to go to at least one of your events. So listeners, if you are in Melbourne with us, please come and say hello.
Yes.
And
Yes,
Alison,
please
thank you
do.
so much for joining us.
Thank you so much, Kate. It's been a blast, so thank you.
If you like The Exploress, and I hope you do, tell a friend about it, or leave a review wherever you listen. That really helps like-minded listeners find the show. You can also shoot me an email via my website and say hi. I really love hearing from you. Thanks to Carly Quinn for all her work on the show, Joshua Stackhouse for my theme music, and Mr. Exploress for my logo.